I was talking to a guy last week who'd spent 30 years as a structural integrity lead for a major aerospace firm. You'd expect a guy like that to be obsessed with carbon fiber composites or, the latest fly-by-wire redundancies. But as we sat there, he wasn't looking at the planes taxiing on the tarmac. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through a leaked internal memo with a look of quiet, focused dread. He pointed to a section regarding their new holistic vendor assessment and said something that stuck with me. He didn't rant and he didn't get angry. He just leaned in and whispered, "The bolts don't know who bought them, and the wind doesn't care about our mission statement." He told me he was retiring 5 years early, not because he was tired of the math, but because he was tired of being the only person in the room who thought the math was the most important part of the meeting. He described a recent safety review where the primary tension wasn't the fatigue limit of a landing gear assembly, but the cultural resonance of the engineering team's composition. He saw the shift happening in real time. The transition from a culture that worshipped the unforgiving laws of physics to one that treated gravity like a social construct that could be negotiated away with enough administrative consensus. That look in his eyes, the sense of a noble betrayal from a man watching his life's work being dismantled by people who have never touched a torque wrench, it was haunting. It revealed a growing systemic rift. We are entering an era where our most critical systems are no longer failing because of a lack of resources or bad luck. They are failing because the managerial class has decided that ideological safety is more important than airworthiness. It makes you wonder, what happens to a civilization when its experts start caring more about the narrative than the thermodynamics? That opening, that story, it just perfectly captures the tension at the heart of this deep dive. Our material today, it really reveals a growing, a systemic rift across some of our most critical sectors. We're talking aerospace, high-tech manufacturing, corporate finance, and even institutional science. We're tracking a really consistent pattern here. The replacement of objective, empirical reality, the things you can measure, test, and prove, with subjective, non-technical managerial or ideological frameworks. And the consequences, well, they're playing out disastrously in the real world.
Right. And our mission today is to look beneath the surface of these recent systemic failures and really connect those dots for you. We're analyzing this fundamental replacement of objective reality. So the uncompromising demands of physics, the established technical standards, empirical rigor, with these softer, more pliable frameworks. Frameworks rooted in management theory, finance, or, ideology. We've structured the discussion into 3 core areas. First, we'll look at the definitive breakdown of technical competence in critical industries, like aviation. Second, we'll examine the mechanisms the modern managerial class uses to capture corporate governance using tools like ESG. And finally, we'll confront the failure of institutions, specifically in science and regulation, where objective truth is being, superseded by ideological consensus.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the clearest, most devastating example of this dynamic playing out. Playing out in 3 dimensions. The Boeing 737 MAX tragedy. The core insight here, it seems, is that the MAX crashes are this devastating real-world consequence of replacing a genuine, hard-won safety culture with what really just amounts to a culture of financial bullshit and managerial decision-making that actively just disregarded engineering expertise.
It's so important to understand this wasn't an isolated incident or just a string of bad luck. This was the inevitable outcome of a slow, a decades-long systemic erosion. We can trace this decay back well over a decade before the first MAX crash, specifically through the warnings issued by people like Stan Sorsher. He was a physicist and a union leader at Boeing. He was sounding the alarm not about a specific bolt or, wing component, but because he saw the fundamental culture changing from the inside.
And what was that change exactly? What was he seeing?
Sorsher observed the erosion of a true engineering culture, one that had built its reputation, its entire brand, on prioritizing safety and quality above all else. And he saw it being replaced by a culture of groupthink, centered on financial gain, rigid financial metrics.
Right, and that shift has a specific origin point, doesn't it? It's not just something that happened overnight. The sources point directly to the 1997 acquisition of McDonnell Douglas. That merger seems to have fundamentally altered the DNA of the company. It brought in a notoriously dysfunctional product line and, maybe more importantly, a new way of managing knowledge workers, a new philosophy.
A completely new philosophy. McDonnell Douglas introduced what was referred to internally as the Hollywood model for managing engineers.
The Hollywood model. What does that mean in an aerospace context?
Well, think about how Hollywood hires for a movie. You bring in a massive crew for a specific project, you pay them for the duration of the shoot, and the moment the project wraps, the team is disbanded. Everyone's gone.
So it's temporary project-based work.
Exactly. This model treated specialized engineering knowledge as if it were fungible and disposable. The practice was to hire engineers only for these acute project deadlines and then fire them immediately afterward to meet quarterly financial targets.
That just sounds absolutely insane for an industry where institutional knowledge, that kind of tribal memory, is a matter of life and death.
It's completely antithetical to it. You're talking about maintaining deep, complex institutional knowledge, the kind of knowledge you need for the safety and staggering complexity of modern aircraft manufacturing. You can't just hire and fire that. It's built over decades.
So the engineers themselves, they must have seen this as an existential threat.
Oh, they did. They staged a massive 40-day strike back in 2000. And it was precisely over the fallout from the McDonnell Douglas acquisition and these cultural changes. They fought tooth and nail.
And what was the outcome? Did they win?
Well, yes and no. They won some short-term material concessions, slightly better contract. But the profound observation here, the real takeaway, is that they lost the culture war.
The culture war.
The financial first managerial mentality, the one focused on extracting short-term shareholder value, it had taken firm root. The old Boeing way was gone.
And once that culture war was lost, I imagine the decisions that followed became predictable because they're not being driven by aerodynamics anymore.
They're driven by accounting, exactly. And the most fatal management decision that directly led to the MAX program was the board adopting a hardline, never again posture.
Never again to what?
Never again to the cost of ambitious new plane designs. Think about the development of the highly profitable 777 before the merger. That was a hugely expensive, long-term, engineering-led project. The new management looked at that and said, never again. The goal shifted dramatically. It went from designing the best next-generation aircraft to just competing quickly and cheaply with Airbus through minimal retrofits and redesigns of existing airframes.
So speed and cost over innovation. They decided the market demanded a quick and dirty solution, not a truly new airplane.
That's it. And that brings us directly to the technical disaster of the MAX. They needed a cheap fix to compete with Airbus's more fuel-efficient models.
Which meant putting bigger, more efficient engines on the old 737 airframe, right?
Right. But you can't just bolt new engines on an old design without consequences. Their placement on the wing created a nasty technical problem. It caused the plane's nose to pitch up too aggressively under certain flight conditions.
An inherent instability in the design.
A deep aerodynamic flaw. And the cheap administrative solution to this flaw was the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS.
MCAS. This is the system at the heart of the crashes.
It is. And this system epitomizes the management over physics approach. Instead of a multi-billion-dollar redesign of the airframe, they invested in a cheap, half-assed bit of software, as some engineers described it. And that software was designed to do one thing: mask the airframe's inherent instability. Its sole purpose was to automatically push the plane's nose down if the system sensed the angle of attack was too steep.
It was fighting the physics of the plane. But here's where the engineering betrayal becomes absolutely staggering from what I've read. The input for this critical life or death override the system that could fight a pilot for control. Where did it come from?
It came from a single, unreliable angle of attack sensor, an AOA vane on the fuselage.
Wait, just one, not two or three for redundancy.
Just one. A single point of failure. It's almost unbelievable in modern aviation. Traditionally, systems that control flight surfaces have multiple redundant sensors. They constantly cross-check each other. If one fails, the pilot gets a warning or the system just shuts down safely.
But not with MCAS.
With MCAS, if that single unreliable vane provided bad data, say, incorrectly signaling that the plane was pitching up when it wasn't, the system automatically took over.
Right.
It repeatedly commanded the horizontal stabilizer to drive the plane into a nosedive.
And we know from whistleblower reports that there were also assembly line lapses that could compromise these guns.
Absolutely. So you have a single sensor, it might be faulty from the start, it gets bad data, and that bad data is prioritized over all pilot input. It caused the aircraft to promptly dive into the ground in both crashes. It was a failure of physics rooted entirely in an administrative decision to cut technical corners for financial gain.
So the crash happens. What was the immediate corporate response? I mean, what's the playbook for the managerial class when reality intrudes so violently?
Well, we saw an immediate aggressive effort to contrast the deadly internal reality with a reassuring public narrative. The playbook is control the story.
And the story they chose was to blame the pilots.
Immediately. Boeing's offenders, their PR machine, they went into overdrive, blaming the pilots, claiming they lacked sufficient training or skill to handle the emergency. They claimed that the pilots should have known how to override the software.
A software system many of them didn't even know existed because it wasn't in the manuals?
Exactly. It's a classic tactic. When the objective reality fails, the laws of physics, the integrity of your design, you blame the operator. You blame external factors. You use your PR machine to craft a new narrative. And they were actively pushing this managerial philosophy that airplane manufacturing is no different than any other business. This corporate assertion that deep, specialized technical expertise is fungible or unnecessary. The idea was everybody thinks his business is different because everybody is the same.
That concept, corporate sameness, that's maybe the most toxic idea in this whole story. This belief that the laws governing a financial institution or a mortgage lender or a plane manufacturer are all identical. It elevates these universal management techniques, process control, quarterly financials, narrative above specific, specialized, and often, unforgiving technical knowledge.
It creates an inevitable internal conflict. A former Boeing engineer, Cynthia Cole, described this so vividly. She called it a clash between the company's historical leadership, which she dubbed the Boeing Boy Scouts.
The Boy Scouts.
Yeah, the ones who prioritize long-term quality and the safety culture. She contrasted them with the hunter-killer assassins.
Hunter-killer assassins.
These were the financial first managers, the ones brought in from outside or promoted for their financial acumen, who were just intent on maximizing short-term shareholder returns, no matter the cost. The objective reality of the ass crashes proves definitively who won that war. The hunter-killer assassins destroyed the Boy Scouts.
And we absolutely cannot let the human cost of that destruction be forgotten or, abstracted away into financial footnotes. Paul Ndroj, a man who lost his wife, his 3 children, and his mother-in-law in the Ethiopian Airlines crash, he provided this devastating testimony. He pointed directly to the fact that executives cared more about its stock price than preventing such a tragedy from occurring again. And you can see the proof in the massive stock buybacks and dividend hikes that immediately preceded and followed the crashes. That's what led directly to the delayed grounding of the entire fleet.
It creates this structural and moral vacuum. Even after immense, undeniable tragedy, the subsequent decisions are analyzed through a financial lens first, not a human one, not an engineering one. And George, who ironically worked as an investment professional himself, he noted this sickening reality, that from a cold portfolio perspective, it would still be difficult to justify leaving Boeing stock out of a client's portfolio, despite the overwhelming human toll.
That's just chilling.
It is, and it demonstrates the complete decoupling of financial success. The managerial metric from technical integrity and safety, the engineering metric, the numbers win, regardless of the physics.
That structural decoupling, this conscious decision to replace engineering reality with a financial narrative, it leads us perfectly into our second part, because we need to decode the managerial class itself. We've seen the consequences of this crisis of competence. Now we need to understand how this class gains and operates power and the specific tools like ESG that they use to actively decouple their performance from true operational risk.
To start, we have to recognize that managers, even those who hold minimal personal equity in a company, they really do constitute a distinct and powerful corporate class. And if we want to understand the source of their power, we first have to challenge our traditional notion of what property is.
Okay, that's interesting. We usually think of property in concrete terms, right? The physical factory, the pile of shares, the inventory. But the material we've analyzed reframes this completely. So tell us about this idea of power derived from redefining property as a social grant.
The shift is fundamental. Property, in this analysis, is not merely physical ownership. It is, at its core, a relationship that is granted by society. This relationship implies the capacity of an individual or a group to act, to make decisions, allocate resources, and crucially, to restrict others from acting. This social grant, the right to control resources and policy within the corporate structure, irrespective of personal ownership, that is what underpins managerial power. They may not own the building, but they control who enters the building and dictate what happens inside it.
So even if the traditional owners, the shareholders, they retain the technical equity, the managers have the real operational control because society, through corporate law, through custom, grants them the right to act on behalf of the entity. But if they don't necessarily own the assets, how do they ensure this class stays cohesive and maintains control over this power structure?
The mechanism is a self-selecting system. It's primarily established through internal promotion and hiring practices. And this system is highly conducive to a concept called similarity attraction.
Similarity attraction.
It's more than just simple networking. It's a deep systemic force. Leaders tend to prefer and actively promote individuals who are similar to them. Similar in background, educational pedigree, professional experience, thought processes, and crucially, corporate values.
And the result of that is homogeneity. As managers climb the corporate ladder, they're essentially creating a self-reinforcing echo chamber. It ensures adherence to these specific dominant corporate values, which often get crystallized around short-term targets like shareholder wealth maximization or increasingly adherence to popular ideological frameworks.
That homogeneity is the source of the rigidity we see in the system. The resulting managerial class, they value process, narrative control, and financial instruments that legitimize their predetermined decisions. And then they view genuine, disruptive, technical expertise. The engineer in the room who says the math doesn't work, they see that person as a bureaucratic inconvenience. As a challenge to the consensus they worked so hard to build via this similarity attraction.
And this intellectual isolation, this bubble, it leads us directly to the rising trend of using ESG metrics in executive compensation.
It does.
ESG, environmental, social, and governance. It's framed publicly as this noble effort to align executive pay with broader stakeholder welfare, right? The stated goal is to move corporate focus beyond just pure short-term shareholder profit. But when you actually dissect the implementation, our analysis reveals that this system is just riddled with structural flaws that actually seem to exacerbate the classic agency problem. They might benefit the manager more than the stakeholder.
That's the critical distinction. Let's dive into the two major structural flaws that are identified in our sources. Starting with structural flaw number 1, the multitasking economics problem. When a CEO is incentivized by multiple, often conflicting metrics, so financial performance, long-term growth, and then these various ESG criteria, they inevitably focus on the areas that are easiest to measure, or the ones that yield the quickest, most visible, and narrative-friendly results.
So the core of the economic problem here is one of resource allocation and focus. ESG metrics, by necessity, they have to focus on these limited dimensions of welfare for a specific, limited subset of stakeholders. Can you give us an analogy for how this narrow focus can actually hurt the company as a whole?
Sure. Think of it this way. A company needs to ensure its manufacturing foundation is stable, its infrastructure is maintained, its long-term research pipeline is funded, the core operational reality. But under a certain set of ESG incentives, the managerial team might be intensely focused on something easily auditable and PR-friendly, like ensuring the entryway to the headquarters is painted the correct shade of eco-green or hitting a specific limited diversity metric target for a certain department.
And the unintended consequence, according to this economics of multitasking, is that this intense focus on hitting those narrow, externally visible targets, the easy win, it diverts attention and resources away from the difficult, crucial, long-term operational areas.
Like fundamental product safety or supply chain resilience.
Exactly.
Precisely. This means the hyper-focus on narrow ESG goals can actually hurt aggregate stakeholder welfare, even if the limited ESG targets are met perfectly. It incentivizes performance theater, the appearance of ethical management, over holistic, difficult, long-term operational health.
So the CEO gets their bonus for hitting the diversity target, for example, while the engineering department suffers from understaffing because financial resources were diverted away from, core competencies.
That's a perfect example.
And then we get to structural flaw number 2, the lack of scrutiny. This is where the opacity of the managerial class really shields itself, isn't it?
It is. Effective scrutiny is absolutely crucial to ensure executive pay arrangements truly incentivize performance and don't just become these opaque entitlements. If the metrics are too vague, too complex, or too easy to manipulate, the system becomes performance insensitive.
Which seems to be the goal.
That is the ultimate goal. When we look at the empirical analysis of S&P 100 companies that integrate ESG metrics into CEO compensation, we find a severe difficulty. In almost all of these cases, outside observers find it difficult, if not impossible, to objectively assess whether these ESG metrics actually provide valuable, performance-driving incentives that are tied to long-term value.
Wait, let me get this straight. So the claim is that executives are being paid for achieving these ESG goals, but the metrics defining those goals are so vague or so complex that a compensation expert outside the company can't even tell if the executive earned the bonus, honestly.
That is the critical outcome. This difficulty, this opaqueness, it means that ESG frameworks, as they're currently implemented, often primarily serve the interests of the executives themselves. They introduce metrics that are incredibly difficult to audit, that obscure the real connection between pay and performance, and therefore render executive compensation effectively performance insensitive. So the executive gets to claim moral legitimacy and social virtue while simultaneously insulating their own massive compensation packages from the risks and volatility associated with genuine, complex operational challenges, like designing a safe airplane or navigating a recession.
So in essence, we've gone from the administrative class replacing the unforgiving reality of physics with a financial narrative in aerospace, to the financial elite replacing the complex reality of economics with a morally resonant but ultimately unmeasurable consensus framework in corporate governance. It's a substitution of verifiable reality with administrative convenience right across the board.
It's a shift from demonstrating competence to signaling compliance. And that brings us to our final section: how this tendency to prioritize consensus and narrative corrodes the very institutions that are meant to provide us with objective truth. Institutions like science and regulation.
Right, because the problem extends far beyond corporate boardrooms and financial audits. It corrupts our fundamental knowledge institutions. Let's start with the human element here. The cognitive biases that plague even the most rigorous scientists and researchers. The statistician Regina Nuzzo gave this powerful warning, noting that even fundamentally honest, high-integrity people are masters of self-deception. We are constantly prone to confirmation bias, to ignoring alternative explanations, and prematurely accepting results we want to be true.
And this internal individual bias is systemically weaponized by the structure of modern research, specifically through what are called researcher degrees of freedom.
Researcher degrees of freedom.
A researcher has to make countless choices in any study. Which variables to include, which data points to potentially exclude as outliers, which comparisons to highlight, which analysis methods to use. And while each choice might seem reasonable in isolation, when you combine them, they provide this vast maneuvering room.
This sounds a lot like what people call hacking. How does this concept of researcher degrees of freedom lead to the manipulation of objective results, even if the scientist is acting honestly, in good faith?
Let's illustrate it simply. Say you are running a drug trial, and you fail to achieve the desired statistical significance on your primary outcome. A researcher who genuinely believes their drug works then starts exploring subsets of the data, maybe looking only at participants in a specific age range, or those who took the drug for exactly 6 months, or those with a specific secondary condition. Each time they run a slightly different analysis, they're using a degree of freedom. They keep running the analysis until they find a statistically significant result in one of those subsets. They simply use the techniques that give them the result they want to see, often without fully realizing how their initial bias influenced those methodological choices.
And this individual tendency is then dramatically amplified by the institutional structure itself. The goal of science is supposed to be finding out what is really true, but when career pressures, publication requirements, funding concerns, when those get entrenched in the supporting institutions, the journals, the universities, the grant agencies, science can be led astray for decades. Because the incentives reward conformity, not critical challenge.
That's where herd behavior becomes so destructive to the scientific process. In any field, if peer support, moral approval, and financial consequences, like the ability to get your next grant, are at stake, then staying with the herd, following the established narrative, is the successful policy for the individual scientist. They secure funding, recognition, and tenure. But this focus on professional self-preservation is disastrous for the pursuit of science itself, which requires diversity of thought and the aggressive exploration of contradictory data.
So the danger here isn't just bad science, it's institutionalized consensus. And that consensus is only scientifically trustworthy if the contributing individuals are genuinely free to disagree without repression or reprisal. But once that consensus becomes institutionalized, it starts actively suppressing opposing ideas, because those ideas threaten the consensus itself and thus threaten the career success of everyone in the herd.
Yes, consensus-seeking processes inevitably lead to what is called premature canonization. It's this widespread, institutionalized belief in a conclusion before that conclusion has been truly vetted, challenged, and stress-tested from every angle. And the result is the suppression of dissenting ideas. Those ideas aren't rejected because they were explored and found wanting. They are suppressed because scientists fear social sanctions, being labeled an outcast, or suffering career damage if they present findings that challenge the canonized view.
We can see the classic symptoms of this institutional failure so vividly when we look at organizations that deal with massive, complex issues that cross the science policy boundary. I'm thinking of something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. When you analyze their processes, you find many of the classic 8 symptoms of groupthink that were described by Irving Janis.
They absolutely manifest. You see the illusion of invulnerability, a conviction of their own correctness and moral superiority, coupled with collective rationalization, where warnings or methodological flaws are quickly dismissed or explained away. And crucially, we see the belief in inherent morality, where the issue is framed not just as a scientific or policy problem, but often in moralistic or even spiritual terms. You hear it described as a collective guilt or original sin.
And when the conversation becomes moralized, then challenging the prevailing narrative is no longer just being empirically incorrect, it becomes a moral failing. You become morally degenerate. And that immediately triggers the other groupthink symptoms. The direct pressure applied to dissenters, the fear of being marginalized as a denier, and the resulting widespread practice of self-censorship, where scientists actively silence their own doubts to maintain unanimity and protect their professional standing.
And it creates this situation where the fear of professional marginalization outweighs the intellectual curiosity and rigor required to follow data that might contradict the consensus. This self-reinforcing confidence, especially when it's driven by a powerful institution or a knowledge monopoly, allows the consensus to become increasingly confirmed and canonized, marginalizing skeptical perspectives simply by making it professionally perilous to challenge the authority of the institution.
And this preference for institutional consensus over objective reality, it flows directly into massive systemic failures and policy implications. Decades ago, former President Eisenhower warned about this precise danger concerning the scientific technological elite taking control of public policy.
Eisenhower pointed out that as research becomes more complex, technologically demanding, and prohibitively costly, government funding often becomes a virtual substitute for true, independent intellectual curiosity. He highlighted the danger that, quote, public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. This means the political needs and desires of the funding agencies or the government can inadvertently or sometimes overtly dictate the intellectual direction and the acceptable conclusions of the research they pay for.
This is particularly relevant when we look at the complexity of predictive modeling for large, chaotic systems. There is a strong critique that the sophisticated tools we use, like the complex climate models, the GCMs, are fundamentally limited, yet we rely on them to drive trillions of dollars in policy decisions.
The critique holds that these complex climate models are often overrated heaps of junk that suffer from fundamental limitations in computing spatiotemporal chaos.
Okay, spatiotemporal chaos. Can you put that into a more approachable context for us?
Sure. Modeling the global climate requires accurately calculating the simultaneous interaction of countless variables across vast distances and timescales. Specifically, things like water vapor and cloud formation. Cloud dynamics alone are incredibly difficult to model because they occur at a scale that's too small for the massive climate models to calculate accurately. Yet clouds have an immense effect on global temperatures.
So if the initial conditions of these critical small-scale variables, like the precise location or temperature of 1 cubic kilometer of water vapor, if they can't be accurately modeled, what happens?
That's the chaos element. Minute errors in measuring or modeling those initial conditions multiply exponentially over time and space. It's a problem Ed Lorenz identified decades ago. If these critical variables cannot be accurately modeled with the necessary resolution, the long-term future predictions generated by these models become inherently unreliable. Yet they are still used by policymakers as if they're undeniable, objective truth. The models are treated as physics when they are fundamentally limited tools constrained by computation and unresolved theory.
And we saw the same tension between this narrow, consensus-driven focus and a more holistic reality play out so dramatically during the COVID-19 response. This seems to illustrate policy overreach, where very specific mandates were enforced by police power based almost solely on narrow public health grounds.
The decision-making was often incredibly narrowly focused on stopping one thing, the virus. It was sometimes described as the best mechanical way to achieve epidemiological suppression, but this was frequently done with insufficient, or sometimes completely absent, consideration of the massive, wide-ranging economic, social, and psychological consequences of things like lockdowns and mandates. This led to incredibly controversial actions, with some observers suggesting that prioritizing these narrow, scientific, elite health metrics enforced by the police power of the state was a dangerous path that disregarded genuine, holistic human welfare.
And the rapid, sometimes contradictory shifts in authoritative guidance during that time further undermined public trust in the experts. I mean, we saw the CDC change its stance dramatically, asserting initially that surface transmission was a major threat, only to later estimate the risk of contracting the virus through surfaces to be lower than 1 in 10,000.
And we had the infamous flip-flops on the efficacy of masks. Dr. Fauci initially told the public there was no reason to be walking around with a mask, but later suggested 2 masks were likely more effective. And then there was the 6-foot social distancing mandate, which was later intensely scrutinized, with a former FDA commissioner stating plainly that that specific measure wasn't based on clear science. End quote. When experts make broad, life-altering mandates based on narrow, rapidly changing science, and those mandates are backed by the police power, the state public trust, inevitably collapses, regardless of the officials' perceived moral high ground or their good intentions. The optics in the administrative process took precedence over clear, verifiable data.
Let's end this section by connecting the theoretical failure of prioritizing managerial consensus back to concrete engineering reality, much like we did with the Boeing example. We need to look at infrastructure vulnerability, where ideological claims meet thermodynamics and the laws of physics once again.
The North American power grid offers perhaps the starkest reality check available. Claims about the resilience and reliability of certain energy sources, often promoted under a strong ideological consensus, were brutally exposed during severe cold weather events, particularly the events across the continent over the last few years. We observed that wind and solar generation experienced massive simultaneous losses. We're talking 70% to 95% for periods of up to 9 days across the entire North American continent during these cold snaps.
And yet the narrative from advocates was often that renewables were performing equal to or better than expected, or that interconnection with other regions, buying power from your neighbors, could solve all the problems. This sounds exactly like the managerial class trying to negotiate with reality again.
It is exactly that negotiation. That narrative clashes directly with engineering reality and the laws of thermodynamics. If the generating capacity is compromised across the entire continent simultaneously for 9 days due to weather, interconnection is insufficient. Your neighbors are suffering the same loss as you are. Furthermore, advocates often base their positive assessments on meeting very low predicted output forecasts. So if they predicted 10% output and they hit 12%, they claim better than expected, completely ignoring that the grid actually needed 90% to keep the lights on.
The engineering reality requires massive excess capacity and multiple non-correlated redundancies to manage the very real spatiotemporal chaos that weather events impose. When those engineering realities, the specific temperatures, wind speeds, power demands, when those are ignored in favor of a political or managerial narrative, like claiming climate models are perfectly reliable or that renewables are always resilient, the infrastructure becomes fundamentally and dangerously vulnerable. The bolts don't care about the mission statement.
They do not.
So we have tracked a consistent theme here across 3 disparate yet critical domains: the objective truths of physics and engineering, the empirical results of corporate performance, and the rigor of the scientific method. In each case, a powerful institutional and managerial force has sought to replace inconvenient reality with a more controllable narrative, a narrative driven by short-term finance, career similarity, or ideological consensus.
The commonality, the thread that connects all these failures, is the systemic preference for narrative and managerial ease over empirical rigor and technical constraints. When the financial elite dismisses critical engineering as merely the same as every other business, when executive pay shields itself from external scrutiny using vague, performance-insensitive metrics like flawed ESG programs, and when scientific institutions prioritize institutional consensus over critical questioning, we are systematically engineering fragility into the foundations of civilization. The integrity of our infrastructure, our economies, and our governing knowledge is compromised when experts care more about the optics and the administrative process than they do about thermodynamics and verifiable data.
That structural lead who retired early, he saw this pattern playing out in a million small, unseen administrative decisions. He witnessed the decisions moving away from those who understood why the landing gear needed to be strong enough to withstand specific weather conditions, and toward those obsessed with the cultural resonance of the engineering team's composition. It's easy to dismiss this as mere incompetence, but what we're really seeing is a calculated move. The managerial class actively chooses convenient consensus over necessary complexity.
The greatest danger in the shift toward this managerial culture is not merely incompetence. It is the calculated replacement of necessary complexity, the difficult verifiable truth, with convenient consensus. When the laws of physics are treated like social constructs, the inevitable consequence is that those systems designed to withstand the unforgiving forces of the world will eventually fail. Not because of a lack of resources, but because they have been consciously betrayed by the culture tasked with their stewardship. The systems we rely on are fundamentally compromised when their architects become more focused on administrative metrics than on the harsh objective reality of the world they're trying to manage.